in more of a poetic format. And there's some interesting things to note about the text, and it's really helpful to teach us how to read the poetry that we find in the Bible, because you don't always get both. Sometimes you just get one. Sometimes you just get the poetic. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we don't misunderstand what we're being told in poetry or in the various ways that we get stories sometimes. And so it's really nice that you get both here. And one of the things, I actually took a class on poetry when I was in college, and it was a very particular type of poetry, and it was the elegy. And I didn't know what an elegy was when I took the class. It's a death poem. And so if you've ever read ancient, when a hero would die and they would write a song about the death of this great hero, that's an elegy. My favorite poem came from that class, An Elegy in a Country Churchyard, and we can talk about that at some other time. But one of the things I learned from that class is that when you get to a poetic section, every word matters. It's different than narrative. And I'm not saying that the words in a narrative account don't matter, that you don't have to pay attention, but when you get to poetry, the word choice becomes even more important. And as you read through a section that is poetic in Scripture, usually editors do a good job of like blocking it off and making it look like poetry. But when you come to those, you have to be very careful about word choice. Why is this word used instead of a similar word? When you get to Job, Job is a long poem, and when you get to the end, and God arrives in the storm, why is God in the storm? Right? He could have come any way. Why a storm? And so then those types of things become important. And one of the most important things in a poem is who is doing the speaking. And very much Proverbs is a very poetic book, written in lots of literary figures and types. And at the end of the book, you have chapter 31, which is actually the pinnacle of the book of Proverbs. And people tend to jump about halfway through chapter 31 to the point that starts talking about the virtuous woman. And you start talking about this woman who has apparently no sleep, and she's just, I don't know when she sleeps, I don't know when she does anything other than all of these things. And we start looking at this person as though she's an actual person. And what happens is we miss the speaker. And if you go to the beginning of chapter 31, it tells you who the speaker is. It's King Lemuel's mother, who is speaking to her son, telling her what kind of king she wants him to be and what kind of woman she wants him to marry. And when you find that out, all of a sudden now what you've got is the focus of that whole section in Proverbs 31. I'm not trying to take anything away from that woman who's there, but what is the mother's concern? If you're a mother and you're thinking about what kind of a parent, right? So you don't have to pretend. If you're a parent, male or female, and you have this child, and you're thinking about who they're going to marry, your concern is mostly for your child, right? You're worried about what their life will be like, how this choice is going to affect them. And so when you read Proverbs 31, the focus of that woman is actually the mother's concern of how she is going to affect her son's life. And when you read through that, where does her son wind up when he marries this woman? Well, he winds up in the city gates. He winds up with people coming to hear his wisdom, coming to get leadership from him. And so the whole point of that is throughout this beautiful book of Proverbs that you've got, there are two women, the woman of wisdom and the woman of folly. And which woman does Lemuel's mother want him to marry? Wisdom. She wants him to marry wisdom. And the result of that will be that he is in the city gates. And so it's this beautiful picture that you see in this, and the whole book has been building up to that. And so when we get here and we have this poem, you're going to see some very similar elements in the book. And one of the first things you have to ask is, who is doing the talking? That's important. And it starts off in chapter 5, on that day, Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, sang. Now, chances are, if you look at the pericope, I always call it the pericope. It's not the pericope. It's the pericope, the little heading in your Bible. What does it say? Song of Deborah, Deborah's song, something like that. Who's singing? From the text, who is singing? Deborah and Barak. Now, I don't know how they divided it up. I don't know if it's two-part harmony. I don't know who is singing when. All I know is that the text says who is singing, Deborah and Barak. There's a couple things that are interesting there. Why is Deborah listed first? What did she say about Barak if he did not do what he was supposed to do? A woman is going to get his glory. And so you're sort of seeing that in the text. The woman is listed first. It's again, you're sort of looking at the pictures that are showing up. It's the opposite of what you see in the creation account. Right? You run into the man first and then the woman comes after. Here you have the woman first and then the man. And it's sort of a picture maybe of exactly what Deborah said would happen. To the point where we even leave Barak out of the title. Right? When people write a title for this, it's called Deborah's Song, not Deborah and Barak. Right? It's sort of like Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Pretty soon the Crickets just get left off. Right? Exact same thing. Right? And so here we are with Deborah and Barak singing. Again, I don't know who sings when. I just know that the text says they're both doing the singing. And they start off, and they're going to say some really interesting things. Because remember, you already know the story. Barak wasn't doing what he was supposed to do. Right? Deborah has to kind of say, why haven't you done what God has told you to do? And then the people haven't risen up. The people aren't doing the things that they're supposed to do. So it takes Deborah coming and sort of prodding Barak along, I don't know, maybe with like an ox goad, and getting him to go and do the things that he is supposed to do. But then when the song starts off, what does it say in verse 2? What did the leaders do? They were leading. And what did the people do? They volunteered. But they only led and they only volunteered after somebody came and pretty much said, you have to do this. And so what we see, it's this really cool picture, is that God is, first of all, incredibly gracious. And there will be times in life where we're not doing exactly what we're supposed to be doing, or maybe we're not doing it as well as we ought to be doing. But the fact that you do it counts. And it took somebody coming and pushing Barak into being a leader. But here when you get to the text, it says the leaders led. They did their job. It took somebody to go and bring the people together, but here they are, they're volunteering. And so you get credit for what you do, even if you need help doing it. And that's important, because this isn't necessarily the way that the world works. And so this is a beautiful picture of Deborah and Barak singing together, and the very first thing it says is that the leaders were leading and the people were volunteering. That is how it is supposed to be. And so you see God counting to the people righteousness, in a sense, right? He counts them as being right. And so the beginning of this song is beautiful. Listen, kings, pay attention, princes. I will sing to the Lord. I will sing praise to the Lord God of Israel. So who gets credit? God. Yes. The leaders led, the people volunteered, and God is the reason why. God gets credit for all of these things. And so when we think about what we're supposed to be doing, when we think about leaders in a family, leaders in a church, it is okay, right? It's okay to ask for help. If you're leading a family and you don't know what you're doing, it's okay to ask for help. God still counts that, right? You're still doing what you need to do. And so the idea that Barak had help in leading those armies, the people needed to be spurred into doing what they should be doing, God doesn't say that. When you get this poetic account, you get the perfect. And so when we are living our lives and we are walking and doing all the things that we should be doing, if we were going to write a poem about what our life was like in service of Christ, it would be written in this perfect way. That's really cool. It's really encouraging, because when God looks at my life, very much like you see over in Ephesians 5, he sees me without wrinkle or spot or blemish, because he is the one who makes me right. It's really cool. Okay, so anything else that you guys notice in those first few verses, or any other thoughts? On okay, I see what you're saying. when the leaders in Israel, when the people volunteer, blessed be the Lord, not necessarily that they did. It could. Yeah. No, that's a good point. It could be saying so the difference of a when and a that, and it would slightly change the meaning, right? And so when you're looking back, if it's a when the leaders are leading and when the people volunteer, then praise the Lord that that's happening, versus a that, that the leaders are leading that. But eventually, I think you do get to the same place. But yeah, but see, that's the word choice, and so uh, yes, of the translator in this instance. And so if anybody speaks ancient Hebrew and can tell us what we should translate, I would anyway. And so, but that brings up a good point. When you're reading something and you're seriously studying it, which is pretty much how you have to read poetry, I would recommend using more than one translation. And I would recommend using pretty different ones. If you use the King James Version and the New King James Version, they're probably going to say the same thing. So I would use like the English Standard, the King James Version, the NIV, and maybe a couple others. You can do that easily now with Bible software, where you can look at several different translations. And the reason why you want to do that is you want to get a feel for what the author is saying. Somebody told me one time the best commentary is getting several different Bible translations and putting them side by side and looking at the different ways things get rendered. I don't know if that's the best, but it's a very good one. And so certainly with poetry, that's helpful. Yep, that's exactly right. In fact, you could even say that leadership really is influence. You could even say that leadership is influence. You're getting people to follow you. You're getting them to listen to what you have to say. You can force people to do things, but that's not really leadership. If I can force you to convert, you see that throughout history, where some army will come in and convert or die. It's amazing how many people wind up converting rather than being killed. But what is the quality of that conversion? I mean, when you read through history, it's almost like, a Muslim army will walk into a region, become Muslim or die, and all the people go, all right, well, we're Muslim now, and nothing really changes, right? Or various times in European history, you'll have the Huguenots come through and take over an area. Hey, you're Protestant now, or hey, you're Catholic now, and the people just sort of go back and forth. It's exactly what it is. It's self-preservation. But when you look at what is being said here, this idea of leaders leading, that's the idea. Yep. That's exactly right. You don't have to be in a leadership position. You don't have to have a title to be leading. You have to be influencing people. That's exactly right. Yep. Yeah. And so it's important for us to realize that as believers, we're constantly influencing one another. We're constantly influencing the people that we interact with in our words, in our actions, in everything that we do. And so we want to lead people towards God. Anything else? Okay, we're going to get some common themes in the Old Testament. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled, the heavens dropped, the clouds dropped their water, the mountains quaked before the Lord, even Sinai before the Lord, the God of Israel. So this is language that you'll see in the flood, right? The fountains of the deep opening, sort of like this giant earthquake, and water flooding out of the ground, water falling out of the sky. You see the same thing with Israel when they're being brought out of Egypt. right? They're going to walk through the water and have walls of water about them. They're going to come to the mountain where the earth trembles, and you get that same language here. And that fits perfectly with what you're seeing in the book of Judges, because these are saviors, right? Deliverers is what the book is. And so here is God. You know, the way we read about it in the historical version is that when the God is with the judge delivers them, and the people are faithful all the days of the judge. And here in the poetic version, you get the flood and the recreation of humanity through Noah. You get the people being brought out of Egypt and formed into a new nation. And so one of the things that you can see is throughout history, when God's people follow the way they're supposed to be going, this is what happens. There's this sort of constant recreation of who they ought to be. And then you have the perfect leader who comes, and these things find their absolute form. And so Jesus, ultimately, is going to be the fulfillment of all of these things. Yes. Yes. It does. Yeah. And so it's really neat that you're getting those things from two different images, from two different ways. And so when you come across language, whether in the historical narrative or here in the poetic, you're being told, and these are things that if I was a Hebrew and I read this story before Jesus, I would not have thought in terms of the ultimate fulfillment of these things being in Messiah. But it's one of those things that in my mind just points out, when you see these themes that show up again and again in Scripture, that there was one plan, and that plan was Jesus. And from the beginning, God is making things happen so that we see Jesus. And once you know Christ, when you go back and you look in the Old Testament text, I won't say he's in every verse, but I will say every verse is driving towards him. And so that's the idea. Is everything in the Old Testament is pushing us toward Jesus, so that when we go back and we read through it now, the veil, to borrow Paul's language, has been removed from our eyes, and now we can see. Now we know what God has always been doing. Anything else? All right, there's a little bit longer section now. In the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways are abandoned, and travelers kept to the byways. The villagers ceased in Israel. They ceased to be until I arose. I, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. This is probably why it's called the Song of Deborah. When new gods were chosen, then war was in the gates. Was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 in Israel? My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel, who offered themselves willingly among the people. Blessed be the Lord. All right, we'll pause there. Your translation may or may not continue on with the white donkeys, but we'll pause there. Okay, so Shamgar is probably about the same time as these things. I don't know that for sure, because we just don't know a lot about Shamgar. But what is the condition of the people when the leaders amongst the people have failed and the people themselves have chosen new gods? It's not good. Yeah, that's a large chunk of what you're seeing here. Yes, the lack of leadership has let things deteriorate, and here you go. There's not was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 in Israel. There's no fighting men in Israel. Is sort of the image that you get, and her heart goes out to the commanders of Israel, who offered themselves willingly. So there are people who are still trying to do the right thing, but it doesn't seem to be going well. And when Deborah comes, she arises as a mother in Israel. Somebody say something? One of the cool things about God is that God takes both of those images. God comes as a mighty warrior. God comes as a gentle nurturer, a shepherd. God comes as a father figure. And God comes as a mother. And it's really amazing to see God takes on all of these images when he is trying to explain to us who he is. And so when Deborah comes, she doesn't say, I came as a mighty warrior. She doesn't come, she comes as a mother, somebody who is sort of nurturing the people is sort of the picture that you get. And it's very telling. God will use very similar language when he talks about his love for the people. Jesus will say something that reminds me of this when he's standing at Jerusalem. You know, I would have gathered you about me as a hen does her chicks, but you would not. And so here is Deborah saying some of the same things or similar sounding things. Anything else that y'all notice? Well, absolutely. Yes. She's sort of in the middle of everything, and the people are coming to her for judgment. In fact, if somebody wants to do like a thought study on this, somebody mentioned to me last week that the palm that she was sitting at produces something that is very much like honey, and her name is a bee. And if anybody wants to go through and look at all the times that honey is mentioned, and how that fits together, and what we might be seeing in that, I would love to read whatever you whatever you find out. We do, yeah. We see honey again with Samson, like the anti-Deborah. So yeah, we'll see the honey again. Yeah. It could be that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I forget who I was talking to, but we were talking about how God raises up and tears down nations, and how judgment comes. You can see it throughout history, and that feeling of, well, what do we do? And the answer is sometimes you can't do anything. Exactly. You will be fine, but you can't necessarily change the course of history. Um, and so when it is appointed for a nation to fall, there is nothing that you as an individual can do to stop it. Your duty, here the picture, your duty is not to alter the course of history, not to change God's judgment. Your job is to be faithful. And that's all you can ever do. Yeah. Yeah. It it could be that this is a reference to them sort of giving over the military command to the Canaanites. All right, so verse 10. I'm reading from the English Standard Version, so if you're reading from that, your text will match. If not, it's probably going to be close. But again, word choice is important. So tell of it, you who ride on white donkeys, and you who sit on rich carpets. How Now, if it's white, how common are like really white donkeys? Yeah, they're pretty rare, which makes them expensive. What did somebody say something over here? Just rare. Yeah. You who sit on rich carpets, you who walk by the way, to the sound of musicians at the watering places, and there they repeat the righteous triumphs of the Lord and the righteous triumphs of his villagers in Israel. Then down to the gates march the people of the Lord. And so depending on how you read that, it could mean a couple things. So you've got in the days of Shamgar and Jael, where there are no villagers, right, and everything is just desolate and everything is terrible. And now you have her telling people who are riding on, very expensive animals, who are sitting on lavish carpets, who are so well-to-do that they have musicians entertaining them while they're getting water from the watering places. And so it's very different. It could be that now you're seeing the result of obedience to God. And so she's calling on those people who are the beneficiaries of salvation to make sure that people don't forget. This is how you got to where you are. It could also be, depending on how you read it, that she is chastising the people who sold out the people of Israel. Right? And they were wealthy because they sold out. And so I'll leave it to you to figure out which. Yeah. Yeah, it could be. And that's absolutely historically true. And so it would make sense then if we see that here in the poem too, where you have a place where life is just desolate, terrible, and at the same time another portion of the nation where things are really, really good. And the call then, which you'll see in just a minute, is where were you? Why didn't you come? It could very well be that. Okay, so verse 12. Awake, awake, Deborah. Awake, awake. Break out in a song. Arise, Barak, and lead away your captives, son of Abinoam. A brief poll. Who says Barak? And who says Barak? Barak? I always, I always say Barak. I'm just curious because there are a lot of names like that. Uh, Ashurbanipal or Ashurbanipal. I say it the second way. The first way's right, but I say it the second way. Yeah, Dan. That guy. Yeah. Mhm. I definitely think that's part of what you're supposed to see is the unwillingness at first. Even though he seems, right, when he knows God has called him to do this, he seems to believe in God. He just doesn't think he can do it. That's what seems to be. Very much like Moses, like some of the other people who there's this daunting task in front of them, and it just doesn't seem possible. But with God, all things are possible, and you do see this transformation. Yes, he is. Yeah, he's mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11 when Samuel talks about the people who delivered the nation. He mentions Barak. I mean, he as far as I'm aware, from this point forward, nobody looks back and says, "Oh, Barak, he was a loser." Right? I don't think anybody says anything negative about him, and I think that's important for us as believers because when you look at where he knew who God was, he knew what God told him to do, but he wasn't just quite willing to do it yet. And somebody had to come along and sort of like push him into it. But once they did, the only way he's looked at from then on is this very favorable way. Yes, reluctance, or you could even talk a weak faith. Like if there's something that you know that you are called to do, and it's just a very difficult thing. I don't want to use examples necessarily, but just think of some situation where you might be called to do something that's just incredibly difficult, and you're reluctant to do it. Well, when you finally do it, what you see is that God doesn't look back and judge you as the reluctant one. God looks back and judges you as the faithful one. And I think that's one of the important, one of the reasons that the idea of being justified through faith is so important. Because that is the only way that I can stand before God. I will never be everything I ought to be. I will never do everything I ought to do. I depend on God looking at my faith and judging me as righteous. And so when Paul, I think if Paul had more time, he probably would have talked about this in Romans. But I think of Paul talking about that, that's sort of the idea, is that God doesn't look at when you were at your lowest or when you failed or any of those things. He looks at when you were faithful. And when your faith carried you through something, that's what he's concerned with. And so it's almost like he looks at the end of the picture. And it's just really beautiful when you see God dealing with people in that way throughout the text. Very much here true, I think, with Barak. Okay, so they have to wake up. They're being called to awake. And it doesn't necessarily mean they were asleep in a bad way. It's just time to go. It could be the idea. Because I'm not aware of Deborah doing anything that she needs to be woken up from. But it does just seem it's time. It's time for them to sing. It's time for them to tell people. It's time for them to be victorious. And so they wake up. They break out in song. Barak gets up. He leads the captives away. They're going to march down, and they're going to be victorious. And that's going to get us now to the part that would sting if you're an Israelite through the rest of history. Sort of what we were talking about earlier, where some parts of the people are responding and other parts of the people are not. And you'll see this in any time you're in an organization. Have you ever done a group project in school? Were those your favorite things to do? Why didn't you like them? Collaboration is hard. That's the nice way to say it. What were you saying? Yes. I went and complained to one of my professors at one time, and I said, our group's not working. I said, it's not working. We can't meet. Some people are not really putting in the effort to meet. People aren't turning things in on time. And I said, it feels like a few of us are doing almost all the work. And he said, welcome to life. Right? And that's sort of the way it is. And anytime you're in an organization, you're going to find stuff like that. So here you have this group of 12 tribes that are spread out over a pretty large area. There's supposed to be, there's really 13 tribes. But these tribes are supposed to be working together. They're supposed to be one people. They're supposed to be following one God. And what you're going to see in this situation is that a few people did all the work, at least when all of the people should have been called. And what's interesting is that in this song, they don't have any qualms about saying, you did your job and you didn't. And where were you? And so throughout the rest of history now, if you're in one of these tribes that didn't show up, this is recorded now in Scripture. And so it's pretty powerful. These are the people who showed up. These are the people who did what they were supposed to. But you, where were you? And that calls to mind that even though we have this beautiful picture of justification through faith, there is a reckoning for those who don't show up. Right? And it's not that their faith was weak. It's not that they struggled to do the right thing. It's just they didn't come. And that's a pretty powerful image also. So we're going to go through and you're going to look at some of these tribes. From Ephraim, their route marches down into the valley, following you, Benjamin, with your kinsmen. From Machir, they march down the commanders. From Zebulun, who bear the lieutenant's staff, the princes of Issachar came with Deborah, and Issachar was faithful to Barak. Into the valley they rushed at his heels. Among the clans of Reuben, there was great searchings of heart. Why did you sit still among the sheepfolds to hear the whistling for the flocks? That's almost like, it seems as though it's almost like Elijah on Mount Carmel going, where is he? Is your God on vacation? He's like, what were you doing? Seems to be the question. Among the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. So when you see that, what does that mean? This great searching of heart. It could be they're indecisive. Oh, are we going to go? Are we going to not go? Their heart's not in it. Yep. And you'll see Jesus use pictures in the New Testament. You know, the one who puts his hand to the plow and then turns back isn't worthy. The one who loves, and he'll list people, the one who loves others more than me isn't worthy. There's this idea of being committed. And so searchings of heart can be a positive thing, right? If you are truly examining yourselves, like if you're looking inward, and you know, who am I? What do I believe? What do I need to do? Right? So the phrase searchings of heart isn't necessarily a bad thing. What makes it seem bad is then the phrase in the middle. You know, why were you stuck at the sheep gates? What were you doing? You know, why didn't you come? And so it's almost, it doesn't seem like a good searching. It's not that they're trying to figure things out. It's almost like, have you ever, like somebody asks you to do something, like one of the most infamous questions in the world is, are you busy on Saturday? Yes. And immediately you go, all right, I need something that has me busy for most of the day, but is mostly optional, so that if they mention something that I want to do, I can back out of this thing. And so there's like this massive computer program that starts running through, and the amount of brain power that we waste trying to figure out an answer to that question is phenomenal. And that seems to be the idea of the searching here, is they're trying to figure out an excuse why they can't go. And so Deborah calls them out. Where were you? What were you doing? Why weren't you there? I don't know. What do y'all think? Ooh, that's new for me. The clans of Reuben, like they're talking amongst themselves. Yeah, indecision. I think that's probably a good English word. Indecision. Yeah, he's kind of in the same place. He's like, oh, I know what I should do, but and and he listens. All right, so we'll go on. Gilead stays beyond the Jordan. They're away. Dan, why did he stay with the ships over by the sea? Asher is still at the sea, the coast of the sea, staying by his landings. But Zebulun is a people who risk their lives to the death, and Naphtali too on the heights of the field. And so you have these contrasting pictures of these people stayed far away, but you have Zebulun and Naphtali and Issachar and these people who have come and they were in the middle. They went to the fight, but others stayed by the side. And at the end of all this, they're still all Israel, aren't they? I mean, at the end of this, Deborah doesn't say, Reuben, you're not part of Israel anymore. And so what we need to consider is you'll see things like in 1 Corinthians 3, where the Apostle Paul is talking about the buildings that we make. And if you want to think of these buildings as our lives, there is a sense in which he talks about some people who build their homes out of gold and silver and precious materials. And when the fire comes and tests those structures, they will stand. But other people are building their house out of wood and straw and perishable things. And when the fire comes and tests them, those homes will be destroyed, but the foundation will still remain. And so there's this sense in here too, where as we're thinking about what's going on, the fact that somebody is struggling with their faith doesn't mean they're not a believer. It means they're weak. And it doesn't mean they're not a Christian. It means they're weak. And one of the things that we have to remember is here you've got these tribes who are not doing what they're supposed to, but at the end of the song, they're still Israel. They're just not who they're supposed to be. And so we have to be careful when we think about all these things that we're not passing judgment on a brother or sister who perhaps is struggling, whose faith is weak. They're still part of the family, but they've been building with wood and straw, and they need somebody to come show them how to build with bricks. Were you going to say something? Yeah. Yeah, they might be doing the Shamgar thing at the moment. They might, yes. That's right. Steve. Right. Yeah. And it takes wisdom to do that in a way that whoever you're talking to will hear you. Because that's the goal, is when you're doing that and you're speaking to somebody, the goal is to get them to hear. Not just to do the calling out, but to get them to hear. And so that's, yes, absolutely. And that's what takes the wisdom of leadership, or wisdom in leadership. I don't know which preposition to use. We'll just stop there. I think we're out of time anyway. Yes, yes.